Great, so it's nice to meet you all. So as Ahmed mentioned, a little bit about myself. So I'm head of operational excellence at Siemens Healthineers for their Ottawa division. Basically, everything that I do there is related to making it run more efficiently, run more effectively, and a lot of doing that combines looking at the design, looking at the manufacturing, looking at their quality systems, looking at their business operations, their HR. So it really touches all of the different aspects of how their company runs. And in order to do that, I built upon a lot of the experience that I've gained over the last 15 years at various medtech companies based in Toronto, many of whom were founded here out of Sunnybrook. So very familiar with the Sunnybrook ecosystem and the startup world, despite having recently transitioned to the giant company world. But I'm happy to be here with all of you today, and I love the MedVentions program, and I think it's so worthwhile, and I'm sure you're learning lots through it. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to give you like a really high-level introduction and overview into just some of the quality requirements, particularly based around ISO 13485. This is not intended to be like a full comprehensive training of 13485. It's not a substitute for if any of you work at companies, if you have SOPs or for your quality team. This isn't even enough information for you to go back and implement a QMS, but really my purpose here is for you to understand why a QMS, a quality management system, even needs to exist, what some of the key components of it are, and then layering on top of that from a really efficiency perspective, because that's really what drives me, why despite the legal need for them to exist, why as a company you want to start to pay attention to them, and as entrepreneurs or budding entrepreneurs or future entrepreneurs, why you should care about them a little bit early. So that's what we're going to go through over the next hour. I'm going to talk about some of the key responsibilities, the key players in it, and then I'm going to look at the three different aspects of it. So one is design and development, what we need to care about during that process, manufacturing, what we need to care about during manufacturing, and many of the things that are often underestimated. And then there's some general overview in terms of what it actually takes to get it going. So I'm really going to summarize really quickly, what are the goals of a QMS? Why does a quality management system even need to exist? And honestly, all of the jargon aside, at the end of the day, the primary goal is to make sure that you as a medical device developer, as a manufacturer, don't hurt anyone. You don't hurt your patients, you don't hurt any of your users, you don't hurt the administrators of the product. That's really the primary goal. So whatever can be done to make sure that your device is safe and effective is why we have these regulations. It's why these exist. And then, because we are people and we make mistakes and we make decisions and trade-offs every now and then, accidents happen, recalls happen, people do get hurt. So the second thing that we need to be really considerate of is if something does happen, you have to have all of the systems in place to be able to respond very quickly to that. And those are really the reasons why the entire QMS exists. So I'm not sure your level of familiarity with quality management systems. A lot of them can seem very overburdening. I know I've worked in some where you can only use a blue pen and things like that, and it doesn't seem like it, but it actually does come back to these two primary goals. And when we get into the nuts and bolts of a QMS, and we're not going to get into that level of detail today, but when you start to get into that, what you'll end up finding is a lot of times those regulations exist to that level of detail because somebody at some point has tried to skirt the system, has done something, has been fraudulent, has had fines, have had people get injured and tried to cover it up or take shortcuts. And as a result, they've now codified it and it ends up kind of being, we all have to pay for these people's mistakes. So if everybody worked on kind of good intentions, it probably wouldn't be so burdensome, but unfortunately that's not how it has all come together. So it's kind of been like these, if it could only be, I don't know how many words this is, 10 words, it might look like this, but in reality, all of the different layers, all of the different legal cases build up. And if you think about this at a global and international scale over hundreds of years, you can imagine how that evolves and becomes a little bit less efficient and a little bit less lean. So that's really the goals of it. The second is a lot of the things that are in place in terms of a QMS that are not related to protecting the customer are actually just really good practices for how to run your own company. So putting things in place, putting checks and balances and procedures in place might seem like it's a lot of red tape, but once a company hits a certain size, having documented procedures and a standard way of operating actually helps the company to run more efficiently, because you're not trying to figure out and define something brand new every single time you go and do it. So it helps to share information, it helps to grow. And I definitely learned this a lot. So when I worked at Turner Medical, they were 8 people when I started, and I joined as their head of quality, and also then took on manufacturing there. And when we were 8 people, it was really easy to have procedures that just kind of said, you know, we need to do the bare minimum, but how we do that didn't necessarily get defined. And then even as we grew to 20 or 25 people, it was really clear that I then was becoming the bottleneck of how we could get things done, because we didn't have a defined process. So every time we tried to do something, someone would be like, I don't know how to do it, I'm gonna go ask Shyra. And I'm like, that's too much. This is now slowing down us as a company. So we needed more structure and more processes in place, which seemed a little bit more burdensome. But once they were in place, we were actually able as a company to move a lot more quickly. So there are times when you kind of hit a tipping point, which isn't necessarily too far into the entrepreneurship pathway, where it becomes actually important to have this in place. Okay, so let's talk about what a QMS is. A QMS, it's a collection of documents referred to as standard operating procedures, or SOPs, and they're defined processes that are used to meet the quality standards and the regulations. And so what they tell you is what needs to be done, when it needs to be done by, who needs to do it, and what evidence will be collected and where it will be stored. So there's kind of a saying in the medtech industry of, if it's not documented, it didn't get done. And that all comes down to when you need to show evidence to an auditor to show that you have compliance to the regulations. What people look for is pure documentation. They don't look for, oh, I know I did that, or I'm pretty sure I had a calendar, like I had a meeting about this, and let me pull up a calendar. They have more stringent requirements as to what is considered documentation and what's a record. So SOPs will tell you what evidence is collected and then where to store it. Like I said, when I was talking about my example with Perimeter, they may or may not tell you how to go about doing the process. And that's acceptable. It's okay. Like, it's not a strict requirement that SOP needs to tell you how to do something, but it has to define what the outcome is. But as I was saying, as you grow, if you don't start to include that information or start to proceduralize it or train people in the same way in terms of how to do stuff, what you'll find is people will do things differently. You might not get the same outcome every time. It might not be efficient, or you might become the bottleneck in that information. And then the last thing I'll say about a quality management system is ISO 13485 applies to everything from Band-Aids to pacemakers. So class 1 to class 3 in the US, and FDA are class 4 in Health Canada. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of different safety controls that are going to be required if you make a Band-Aid versus if you make a pacemaker. And so the way that it's written, if you ever get to the point where you are reading the regulations, is it appears very generic. And a lot of times what you'll see is it's up to the manufacturer to determine the extent in which that they apply to this, or it's as appropriate as determined by the manufacturer. So what that means is that you, as the entrepreneur, as the one running the company, within your entire department, within your QA team as well, have the ability to say, okay, to look at your device and look at the product that you're making and say, well, what do I need to do to control the risks? And this goes back to that number one thing that our entire QMS is based around, is not hurting anybody. So what manufacturers are asked, and when we say manufacturer, it's not just the person making the device, it's everything from design and development all the way to field service, installation, sales. But what they ask of the manufacturer is, based on your product, what are the risks of your product and how do you control them? So the extent of the control is based on exactly that, and that becomes a localized decision within your product team and within your company. Okay, so Let's talk QMS responsibilities. There's a lot of people involved. From an external perspective, you have ISO, you have FDA, you have Health Canada. These are the people that create the standards and regulations. You can also be audited by any of these. There's external auditing agencies as well. So the bottom, they are the third party that inspects the QMS and issues certifications on behalf of these external parties. If they do find issues or they find major issues, they have an escalation system, and then as a result, you might find, you have your external auditor coming in and auditing you. They find that you don't actually fully comply with the QMS, and then the FDA might show up. Because we're in Canada, they actually have to give us a notice period, but if you're in the US, they would show up. They have the right to show up the next day without any notice. So that's how the external parties and the external auditors work together. Within each company is responsible for implementing SOPs. As I mentioned, it's based on your specific medical device risks. And in particular, the quality team is generally the one that's assigned to align the internal SOPs with the external standards. That said, it is not the qualities team to make sure everybody's following the SOPs. That is everybody's responsibility, including the managers of different departments. So if there's an SOP in relation to purchasing or how we procure parts, then everybody in that department, everybody involved in utilizing that process is responsible for making sure that they are following the SOP. And then also internally is we have internal auditors. So these generally play the role of what I like to refer to as fresh eyes, somebody who's not involved in the day-to-day of that process to come in and actually make sure two things. One, what you're actually doing aligns with the SOP, and then two, that the SOP actually aligns with the regulations. So it's almost kind of a two-step process to say, did you do what we said we were going to do, and then is what we said we were going to do the right thing to be doing? So it's a two-step process for that. And so this is kind of important because a lot of times when looking, especially at smaller companies, but even in larger companies, people might think like, oh, the QMS is the quality team's responsibility. I'm just going to go design, or I'm going to go do my testing. But in reality, the QMS touches everyone within the company. And if your QMS is overly burdensome, or if your QMS is insufficient because it doesn't have enough controls, then it's going to change the heartbeat of the company in terms of how it runs and how people operate together. Before I jump into design and development, I just want to take a pulse check. Is everything okay? Speed, volume okay? Yeah, yes. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's talk about some of the key phases of the design and development process. It's broken down into 4 boxes on here, which grossly underestimates the amount of time and effort and sweat and tears that go into design and development, quite frankly. But in a gross summarization, we start with defining our product requirements. What do we need to design? Then we go into the development phase. Then we go into testings, which is referred to as design verification and validation. And then we move into transfer to manufacturing. And again, in reality, there's all sorts of arrows and loops back and forth as we try and we learn more about our product. And quite frankly, there's a whole exploration phase that starts even prior to this of like, do we even have technology that's even feasible to turn this into a product? Do we even have a use case? All of those things happen outside of this. And the reason I don't have any of that listed here is because all of that can happen outside of a quality management system. So a quality management system really starts to take form when we're like, okay, we are now actually designing a product for a specific use case. So let's start bringing in the rules and the regulations, and we are required to bring them in through the design and development process. So let's go through what we're talking about when we're defining product requirements. So first, this is where we're talking about the clinical use case and the benefit. This is really, why are you designing your product? How is it going to be used? You want to be able to say, what is the benefit to the patient, or what is the benefit to the healthcare deliverer who's going to be working with it? And then you really need to be able to map out in the workflow of the product or in the workflow of the clinician, where is your product going to fit in? How are they going to use it? How are they going to interact with it? How is the patient going to interact with it? So that's all about defining that use case. And then breaking it further down into terminology that's generally referred to as your user requirements and your product specifications. So your user requirements are going to be things that the user needs for it to have. So does it need to have a monitor? Does it need to have 2 monitors? Those would be the user requirements. Or if you're designing something from an imaging perspective and you're going to be displaying images, you know, does it need to have a monitor that allows you to visualize whatever type of image you're displaying? And then that delves one step further into your product specifications. So product specifications is more engineering related, and it's more like, I need a monitor that has a resolution of X in order to meet, in order to be able to visualize an image in this way. So user requirements really come more from your use cases, and then product specifications come more from how you intended to meet those use cases. So even up here, a lot of design decisions are already being built in, and even marketing decisions are being built in, because here you're already saying to yourself, okay, if I'm trying to visualize X-rays, well then I don't need to worry about MR scans, or I don't need to manipulate them in the same way that I might with a 3D image or something like that, whatever it might be. But already here you're making marketing choices, or you have major marketing choices, and they're feeding into this use case and these user requirements. The next step here is identifying clinical risks. It's a short bullet point, but it's a lot of work, and this is really what then stems that extent of controls that I was talking about in terms of how many controls we want in place and what risks we're willing to accept here. But this, you can't identify your clinical risks unless you actually know what your clinical use cases are. And then the last step here is that we need to have a plan, like an actual documented plan for the design and development phase. So one of the requirements of the QMS is that you document your plans as you enter into each of the different phases, and then as you exit the phase, you have a report that shows that you met your plan. So in 2016, they changed the regulations. It was implemented in 2019, but it was released in 2016. But prior to that, technically the QMS only required 7 documented SOPs, and now it requires a lot more, again, because they were finding people didn't have documented SOPs, and as a result, there was a lot of lack of control. So over the last 10 years, or 5 years or so, we've seen a shift in terms of how much documentation the standards actually require. And one of them is we need to have plans for each of our phases, and we need to, basically, it's the same thing. We need to make, as internal auditing, we need to show that we planned what we were going to do, and then we did what we said we were going to do. And if it's okay to be able to go back and modify the plan, you'll see revisions on this all the time, and that's completely fine. But you just have to have justifications for why you are changing your plan. So, yes.
So you mentioned that in the company that you worked with, they didn't necessarily have SOPs and use QMS at the start when it was smaller, but then they did once it got larger. So I was wondering, is this like, because this is the very first phase, right? So was the reason you guys didn't have it because you weren't like doing clinical studies yet, or was it just because it wasn't like it's a choice?
I'll clarify actually. So we did have it, but we had SOPs that met the QMS requirements, or the 1345 and FDA requirements. We didn't have them spelled out in a lot of detail. So that's where I was saying, like, there's a lot of flexibility for how processes could be executed, but we did have the skeleton of what was needed in order to meet the requirements. But you bring up a good point in that the QMS and the start of the QMS is actually required long before clinical studies. So clinical studies in this portion here is in this design verification and validation stage. But a lot of the engineering will happen, well, as I was saying, the marketing and things happen before these boxes even start, and a lot of the engineering happens in this defined product requirements, and then possibly a couple of years in development, right? So this is not just when you get to clinical studies. You actually need this documentation from long before that. Great questions. Okay, so I talked about why we do this, or why this is needed from a quality perspective, but just from running a business perspective, there's a few good reasons why we should do this anyways. One is And I know everybody hates documentation, but I'm actually a really big fan of visualizing things and making sure that people are on board. So I find that if you have to actually write something down and you get your team together to do that either together or to review it, you find out that people aren't actually talking the same language, or people will say the same thing, but it doesn't mean the same thing to two different people. And so even just having these conversations, forcing people to write it down, actually pulls out, oh, what product are we designing? Oh, I thought that was phase 4, but no, you want that in like our first prototype, our first go to market launch. Okay, let's talk about that. What does that mean? So it's great for just having those conversations, making sure the team is on board, even if you're a team of 4. Like, a lot of miscommunications can happen in that, especially as you're working and you have different perspectives and are just, quite frankly, probably overloaded. So it forces you to kind of get all on board in the same way. The second is once you have your user requirements, your product specifications, and you can actually look through them and say, hey, we meet all of these, technically you should be ready for market. And there's a thing of like, development is never going to be done. One of the things about medical devices is even once you launch to market, you can continue to make changes to your product. It's unlike the pharma world where when they launch to market, their product, their manufacturing is set. I don't think I could ever work in pharma because I like change, I like constant improvement. And so medical devices, we really need to be considering, okay, if we want to implement more features, if we want to do more, what's the cost of that? Do I have funding to do that? What happens if I delay my market launch? So all of that really comes together here when we're defining our user requirements and our product specifications to know what's our minimally viable product. What can we take to market? And when I said like revisions to our documentation and our plan are completely acceptable, that is one of the reasons that that's true, is because our definition of our MVP can change over time. As our competitors move forward, as other research comes out, we might need to add or remove or change product specifications, and that's completely fine. And then the last thing that I would say about this in terms of why we like to document it, or why from a business perspective it's good to document, is it also gets agreement on what the tasks and the deliverables are, particularly when we're talking about that design and development plan. And it creates a project plan that we can then have milestones to execute upon. So that plan then becomes very helpful when you're looking to investors to say, this is our design development plan. You will probably not show the same version that's in your QMS. You'll make it one a little bit prettier to take out a lot of like the smaller details, but you can then say, look, as we enter into this phase, these are the key milestones that we need to hit. We need an additional 2 resources. This is what our funding is going to go to. This is what our clinical studies are going to look like. And you can help to budget, and you can help with your financing from that perspective as well. Okay, so then we enter. So now we've set up all the framework, we've got our project plan, we're kicking it off, we're entering into development, the crux of the engineering, the crux of the research. This is like the heart of the product, and it takes up 1 slide. So here what we're trying to do as we go through the engineering is we need to be thinking constantly about what is our patient risks and what are our user risks. And the reason we talk about patients and users is because they're not always the same, right? So right now in Sunnybrook, we're in a hospital, a lot of the clinicians here utilize medical devices, but they're not the end user of medical devices. So we do look at things from both perspectives. And then as we're going through the development, as we're making decisions, as we're choosing a circuit board with a specific capacitor, as we are, choosing to make a mechanical part that only has a certain strength or only has a certain amount of ductility, that's fine. We're just making design decisions. So we need to be documenting what those design decisions are, whether it's through drawings or it's through a report that provides the background and the rationale for why we picked that. A lot of that all gets documented, and at the end of the day, it forms what's referred to as the design history file, so a DHF. And the DHF is something that then gets submitted as part of the regulatory submission. So when you go to get your Health Canada, your FDA, your EU approvals, you'll actually end up submitting most of your DHF. So documenting it as you go helps to build that together. And then part of the quality requirement is actually that you need to have evidence for who approved those decisions. So what the intent here is that you don't just have anybody unqualified to sign off on a decision, right? So I'm not a chemist, and you're making a product that has chemistry in it, and not only am I not trained as a chemist, I have no experience working in chemistry, but then I sign off on a chemical specification, they're going to question that relative to the risk of it, of course. If it's Loctite, it's probably fine for me to sign off on it. If it's an enzyme, it's not. So things like that. They want to know that the people who are approving decisions are actually trained and qualified for those decisions. And that qualification doesn't have to only be education. It can come through various paths of a resume, other job work experience, justification in terms of the amount of research, things like that. But it's a quality requirement that shows somebody approved this, somebody agreed to this. And then those are kind of the key quality requirements. But from a business perspective, we want to be doing things a few different ways. One, when we're talking about the patient and user risks, that risk file is going to be really key and really crux to everything that you end up doing as a company later. So if I come back again to the purpose of a QMS, which is don't hurt anybody, identifying your risks up front and understanding what they are and how your device can be used and quite honestly misused. So that's part of the requirements as well. If people intentionally go out of their way to misuse it, what could happen and how do you design and how do you protect against that? And we want to then, from a business perspective, prioritize our actions based on those risks, right? So you want to start with the highest one first, and then work your way down, or highest group of them first, and then work your way through those. The other thing, especially when it comes to documentation, is if you're documenting as you go through, one, it makes it a lot easier when you go and you try and submit your regulatory filings, even if the documentation might seem a little bit light. It's easier to build upon something that exists than try and pull everything from your memory all at once. And then the second is if, as your company grows, as you manufacture, and then, as I was talking about, you can make changes to your product once it's in the field. Once you start doing that, sometimes you want to make a change, but you're like, I don't know why this was picked in the first place. So if I change this, I don't know if it's going to affect something else, or if it was just picked because it just had the shortest lead time at the time that they were working it, which is a completely acceptable reason for a design spec to be picked. But it just helps to understand in the future when you go to make those changes, what are you actually impacting? And I will say there's no chance you will document 100% every part, every design, every decision. But the critical ones, the critical to quality ones, those are the ones you should really be focusing on. And anything, again, prioritized based off of the risk, documenting those a little bit more.
I just had a question about iterating your product and things like that. I was wondering, like, if you're changing the user requirements, things like that, does that affect your 510K? Like, would you also have to worry about regulatory issues?
You absolutely, so any design change that's made after the product has its clearance, or after the product is submitted for clearance, has to go through an assessment to determine if it impacts your 510K or if it impacts your regulatory findings, depending on the extent of it. So you might be able to change your user requirements without impacting that. The FDA has a really nice flow chart of, are you changing this? If yes, then this. If no, then this. And so you can follow that through, and it'll tell you, do you need a new submission or not?
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have to do that even if you're changing something that you still meet the requirements? Like if you're changing materials or something, that would also apply? Okay.
Yeah, because you could be changing the strength of a material that causes it to be more brittle, which might actually impact a use case. Again, because these regulations cover such a broad spectrum of devices, they leave it up to the manufacturer each time to make that call. And so that's why when the external auditors come in, there's two things that they really look at. One is CAPAs, and we'll talk about that towards the end. And then the second is your change control, which is all about once you're launched to market, how do you assess your changes? Did you assess them correctly? Are you still looking at your risks? Are you basically doing a mini development process?
Okay.
Yeah. No problem. Yeah.
So the question about point number 3, so is that actually a part of the MDL application to show evidence for like who approved the decisions along the way?
You would have to show evidence of who signed off on any of the reports or any of the specifications as you submit them. You don't typically have to submit their resumes or anything else along with that, but they can ask.
So this can be also like internal employees.
Yep.
And then any external advisors and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So when I was working as a consultant with a few different companies, many of them had my resumes, my certifications on file. So even though I wasn't signing, I mostly wasn't signing off on things for my clients. They had that on file because I was advising them on decisions to take.
And then just last question, is there any like guidance document to see like, which qualifications are enough for a certain type of requirement?
Not one general one to answer that kind of broadly. Yeah. I would say typically if you were thinking about a job description for that type of role, whatever you would put in that would generally be sufficient. I haven't seen anybody dig further into that unless it's something like pretty glaringly obvious. Okay. Great. Okay, so now we get into testing. This is everything from internal testing, benchtop testing, clinical validation, all of that falls into, again, a really small slide for a ton of work. So what we refer to this as is verification and validation. And so just quick thing on terminology. Again, this is a two-step process, kind of like the auditing. It's verification is, did you build what you said you were going to? So do you meet your product specifications? But then validation is, did you actually solve that clinical need that you were looking to solve? So do you meet your user requirements? So you want to do this at the two different levels. So does your product meet the specifications? And then does your product solve the problem? And depending again on your product and the risk level and how it's being used, you might do this on a benchtop. There might be some level of clinical validation depending on the market that you're going to. You're going to have to define your clinical studies in a very specific way, or you'll be able to pull different justifications or leverage other types of testing. But from a business perspective, there's two things that we're trying to do here. One, you want to make sure your product actually works for the customer. In theory, if you just do your verification of did I build what I intended to, that doesn't actually mean that you can go and you can sell that product, right? Because your customer might not like it. Your customer might not actually want to use it. It might actually be more disruptive to their workflow than helpful. So understanding, does your product work for your customer? And then the second thing that always comes up through testing, nobody passes testing the first time. It's just not possible, which is fine. But what you start to understand more is you start to test the limits of your design. And that helps to inform your future iterations. Where can you do cost cutting? Where can you do improvements? Where do you need to add features or robustness? So you get a lot of understanding of your design through the other phases as well, but there's always seems to be just a surprising amount of more information that comes through testing as well. Yeah.
Sorry, I just have another question. I've also heard the term process validation before. Does that fit this definition?
We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So once we start, let's say we've gone through all of this, we've got a product, it meets all the requirements, it's tested, it's quote unquote good to go. And then I talked about this a bit. We've got records of this. So we've compiled our design history file, which is all of those design decisions, the documentation that led to that. And then we've got our device master record, which is how are you going to build your product? So think about this as your blueprint to build a product. It's your drawings, it's your work instructions, so how your manufacturing is going to work, or if you have automation, or if you have the manual assembly, how is all of that designed? How is that going to come together? It's your equipment specs. If you have software, which almost every product now does, it's your source code. All of that falls into your DMR. It is a QMS requirement that you have something that is actually called a DHF and you have something that is actually called a DMR. And those things together go towards your regulatory submissions. And we talked about this already, so documentation really helps when 5 years from now or even 6 months from now you're looking back to go, what am I asking my supplier to build? What am I trying to build in manufacturing in and of itself? And if I end up in a situation where I need to investigate something went wrong either in production or in the field, well, what was I trying to do to begin with, and how, and that kind of becomes the base. So documentation, records, not just a QMS requirement, but it becomes important for practical reasons as well. Okay. Before we get into what's needed for manufacturing, let me just talk quickly about change control. So I talked about when auditors come in, they really focus in on your change control. So the graph on the left talks about costs of change. So when you're earlier on in your product development process, or even pre-design and development, it's a lot easier to make a change and costs a lot less, right? So if we're thinking about scale, if we're thinking about design for manufacturing or design for assembly, design for testing, DFX is kind of what sums it all up. It's a lot easier to pull in those requirements up front. If you have the luxury of having advisors who can think about your manufacturing, think about service, think about the product requirements, how you're going to test it, things like that, it would be really beneficial to start pulling them in earlier on in the design phase. I say if you have that luxury, because a lot of times finance will, your funding will limit your ability to either engage with those people or hire them on board or whatnot. So you can do the best that you can do with the funding that you have. So I'm just telling you the ideal state. But what we want out of change control. So let's say we've got a design, we've got it on market. Essentially, anytime you go to make a change, and this is what we're talking about, we need to look back, you know, are we changing our product requirements? Are we changing our risks? We need to actually talk about why the change is necessary, and then what does that mean for product that's already built and your regulatory submission. So what we're talking about there is, you know, if I'm making this change now, is it an improvement? Totally fine. Is it because there's a safety risk to the existing product? Not so fine, because does that then mean that the product that's in the field is a safety risk? Do I have to recall that from the field because those users or those patients could get hurt? So we need to think about that every time we make a change. But you know, if we're making a change because it was, I don't know, one of the parts was pink and we've changed our marketing and we've changed it to blue, it's fine. But we still need to go through and say we assessed all of these things. From a production perspective, if we're making a change to a physical part, we want to consider the impact to interfacing assemblies, processes, equipments, even similar products. So let's say you've got 3 products on the market and there's 2 that are very similar, and you're making a design change to a circuit board on one because it has a risk of overheating. Your change control process is going to ask you, do you have any other similar products that could also be at a risk of overheating for the same, I don't know, capacitor issue or something like that? If the answer is yes, you need to change that product as well. So they're really focusing in on making sure that you don't just, you know, band-aid a fix, but you're actually thinking holistically about all of your products on the market. Like I said, it's a mini design and development process. So you need to conduct training to the change. So anybody who was trained on the old design or the old process, or if or like how it's being used, do they need to be trained to anything new? And then the change needs to be approved by the same functions as the original approver. So if in the original specification for our product, we had marketing sign off, and now we're changing something, marketing still needs to sign off again. And from a business perspective, we do this because we want to pull in cross-functional awareness of changes. We want to be able to plan for and execute on changes, and we also want to be able to, you know, figure out how we handle parts. That's what we mean by disposition in supply chain, manufacturing, and the field. So what are we physically doing with our inventory? So all of that comes down to our change control process. I'm running a bit behind on time, so I'm just going to go for about 5 more minutes, but I'll talk about transfer to manufacturing and cover a lot of the rest of this kind of on the slide. So from a quality perspective, transfer to manufacturing is really saying, okay, we've got our design, that's awesome. I once had a boss who was my director of manufacturing at the time saying, engineering's role is to make something once or a dozen of times to kind of get it through clinical trials, and it's manufacturing's role to make that same product over and over and over and over again. while they both take a lot of engineers, I'll be quite honest, it's two different skill sets, and it's kind of two different passions as well, so kind of keep that in mind. Not a lot of R&D engineers actually want to be manufacturing engineers, and vice versa. Like, I definitely love manufacturing a lot more than I did R&D, and that's fine. And the reverse is also true. So when we talk about manufacturing and we really think about the goal is repeatability. If we want to make something over and over and over and over again, we want the product to look the exact same every single time. We want it to work the exact same every single time. So whatever we come up from our processes and our manufacturing work instructions, or whatever automation or whatever equipment that we want to do, we want to be defining that and documenting that with the same care that we are our actual design. And I say that because a lot of times, especially when we look at financing and we look at milestones, it's like, great, get this to your regulatory clearance and then launch it. And we forget that when we're looking at the launch part, that repeatability is a concern, because we want to be able to, again, do the same thing over and over again. And so how good are our processes? How good are our work instructions? This is where process validation comes in. So process validation is intended to test if we follow our DMR, will we get the same product every single time? And so that's where process validation is required. And then when we talk about equipment, so just like our product will have limitations, it'll only be able to work in some situations, or it'll have bounds or things like that. Even the equipment that we use to build will have limitations. So something as simple as calipers, calipers might not actually be used, might not actually be the right tool for measurements. You could actually be like, oh, in this situation, I need a micrometer. In this situation, a regular ruler will be fine. So did we actually give a lot of thought to the equipment that is needed? Are we over-defining? Are we under-defining? Do we have the right resolution? Do we have the right accuracy? Then we want to be figuring out, okay, so we're building this over and over. How do I know that the product that I'm building is good? So if you're making capital equipment, if you're making one large piece that you can test, you can probably do end-of-line testing and it's fine. You don't want to fully rely on end-of-line testing, because from a business perspective, you build something and you test it at the end and then it doesn't work. You've got to go back to the beginning or go back to some point through. You've likely got to disassemble something, figure it out, and then fix. So you want to be able to figure out, where am I testing my products? And then not all testing, some testing is going to be destructive, meaning when you execute the test, that sample that you're testing on can no longer be sold. So currently working at Siemens, we make blood gas analyzers. So when you go and get lab work done, the blood that's drawn passes through a card or a disposable, and once that card is used, it's used. And so even in our own internal testing, everything that we do is sampling, because we can't ever test the card that goes out in the field and then still have it be used after. So what are your sampling protocols? What's the statistics that you have based off of your lot size, based off of your production controls to justify the number, in our case we call them cards, the number of cards that need to be tested in order to release the whole lot, to say it's an acceptable level of risk. So thinking about it that way, yes.
Can you give an example for a process which is not 100% verifiable, how to identify that?
Yeah, so
Percentage.
Yeah, so the cards that I just mentioned, that's not 100% verifiable. So when we say 100% verifiable, that would be for every single card that comes off the line, we'd be able to test that and know that it functions correctly. But because the only way to test this product is to use the product, it would be destructive testing. So it would mean that we would no longer be able to sell anything, because we would test 100% of everything. Yeah.
So is it about the whole?
So-
Sorry, is it about the whole product or?
Yeah, okay, great question. How much testing do we need to do in production? Yeah, so what that really comes down to is the risks. So back when or in design and development, when we were talking about, how is this product going to be used? What are the user risks? When we transfer to manufacturing, we also look at process risks as well. And so it comes down to which portions of that need to be tested in order to make sure that we've contained any risks to the field. And then the extent and the level of that risk will also then determine the extent of that testing. Yeah. Sorry, I think the lady in the pink person then.
So when, let's say you're outsourcing your production, and obviously let's say the production or manufacturing company will have their own QMS system and their own quality management processes, how do you manage the merging of the two?
Yeah, so I worked with external manufacturers, and my recommendation is as you select your contract manufacturer, as you select that partner, audit them thoroughly to really understand what their quality management system is, and then only go with a supplier that you can trust. Because leading to then answer your question, my recommendation is to almost fully rely on their QMS. So I have, I will just be honest, made the mistake of going with a supplier where it's like, they've got all the right technical capabilities, but their QMS is not strong. We'll supplement it with our own QMS. And it added so much overhead because, quite frankly, that supplier is not used to working that way, and they then have to go out of their way to work with you, and it doesn't create it creates burden, it creates cost, it creates frustration, things like that as well. So my recommendation is upfront, when you're selecting that supplier, don't just focus on technical, focus on all the other support system and the QMS as well, and drive that into your decision making.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Just a question. So when you said that there are some products where you cannot verify and test them 100%, in that case, does it depend on organization, or do you do randomized sampling, or is there like a formula where you go like, if we make 100 cards, then we're going to test, I don't know, 10% of them randomly to make sure, and then this batch is then, verified?
There's two ways to look at it. One is you have to understand your processes to know where your variation exists, and then you have to be able to identify within that what's my lot size, or how am I going to define that lot. And then there are tables, like AQL has a whole bunch of tables in terms of the level of risk that you might be willing to accept with that sampling. So it's a multi-stage process.
And are there standards for those as well? Like, is there a certain set of standards that you have to follow that have been set by, say, the ISO, or?
Depending on your product, there might be. So I know for some very specific processes, they actually say this is how you need to do it. For general products, like as a product overall, no. So that's why you have to break down your product into the different processes and then look that up. Yeah. Great. Okay. One of the other things I want to just talk about here, sorry, I'm going to just do this quickly and then run through this. One of the other things, we touched on it briefly, is in terms of suppliers and documentation. And so when selecting your suppliers during the prototyping and early engineering phase, use whoever makes sense. Use whoever is going to get you the product fastest, cheapest, get you through your testing. But when you're actually looking for suppliers who are going to be your production suppliers, put a lot more care and thought into this, because you want to be able to pick suppliers who you can scale with, right? So look at your market size, look at how many products you intend on selling, be a little bit realistic about it as well, and then say, okay, the supplier that I'm working with right now, how far into my launch are they going to take me? Are they going to take me 6 months? Are they going to take me 5 years? And then work with them and build that up. And so if you have a good supply base, if you have a good system set up, you can then be able to leverage your work with your suppliers for cost breaks or efficiencies, or a lot of times they'll work with you to design your product slightly better, that component better, that actually saves you both money and things like that. So you want to be able to work with your suppliers. And the other thing that I will say about suppliers, actually I'll say 2 more things. One is documentation. So that documentation, that DMR package, when we were talking about drawings and work instructions and things like that, that's what goes to your supplier. And that's what they're going to build. And that's your essential legal contract with them for what they're going to supply. So if you skimp out on your drawings and you don't fully dimension something, and then they make it differently, or it's not listed as an inspection criteria, you don't actually have a leg to stand on to go back to them and say, you didn't make this part correctly. And so you need to eat the costs of fixing it, or you need to supply us replacement costs, or here's the consequences for that. So it comes back down to that documentation package. That becomes really important there. And I was gonna say something else about suppliers, but I've forgotten, so maybe it's not as important. Yeah, you were gonna
Oh, yeah,
ask
I
me a
had
question?
another supplier question. I was just wondering, do you have the option to validate a process instead of doing 100% verification?
Yes, you do. Yeah, sorry, the bullet point there is you actually have to validate processes that aren't 100% verifiable. So the sampling and whatnot can be used as an extra process control, but validation would be making sure for each step as you go through the process, what could go wrong, what are your limits of it, what controls do you have in place, and then moving it through the next step and doing that same thing over and over
Okay,
again.
I guess my question was like, if a process could be 100% verifiable, could you instead validate it?
You still can,
Okay.
yes, yeah. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there because I believe we're at time almost.
I have 6 minutes.
Oh, I
but
have 6 minutes. Okay,
but
so-
I think people are asking questions during the.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that I'll just kind of end on is in terms of manufacturing, and I said this already, but I'll highlight it again, is don't underestimate how much it will take to scale. So as you go through your design process, you will absolutely be making trade-offs to say, we just gotta get this done, we'll fix it after lunch. That's gonna happen, it's fine. But if I come back to this cost of change, ease of change, after launch, every cost is exponential. Just look at like the amount of decisions you have to agree upon cross-functionally every time you try and make a change, right? So just the amount of overhead associated with it is a lot higher. So you will be making those trade-offs, you will be making changes after you've launched your production. But if you have the opportunity up front to incorporate things differently, even if it's things like, I know there's something I've done where it's like, oh, we'll have 2 circuit boards for now, and when we launch, we'll make it 1. Well, when we launched, we tried to make it 1, but it changed the form, it changed, so which meant we were changing not just the circuit board, but the enclosure that it was going into, and then it changed a lot of other things, and actually it was more costly to change it than it would have been, and so we actually never ended up changing it. So things like that will happen, and that's okay, but whatever you can do with whatever foresight to prevent that will help ease that launch. Great. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Just a question. I'm a little confused about the diagram. So my understanding is that the cost of change is low at the beginning, and obviously as we go through the process, it increases, which makes sense. Why does it say though that the ease of change is is it more difficult to make changes in the beginning and then it gets easier? Is that what it means?
Ease of change is, sorry, this is high. So ease of change is high and cost of change is low at the beginning. So once it drops down, as you move through the process, the ease of change is low, meaning that it's harder to make change. So maybe it's just the wording there.
Oh, okay.
So
Got it.
yeah, because when you're up here, you're prototyping, you've got one mold, you can drill a couple of extra holes in it into your enclosure to make something else fit. When you're over here, you're working with your suppliers, you're trying to change an actual design. Over here, it might not even be in SolidWorks yet, so you can just do whatever you want. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about recalls, right? And it is of course a huge problem,
Yeah.
especially in your early phases. I forgot what the stats are, but like 80-something% of all medical devices in the first year get recalled once they make it to the market.
I've not heard that stat, okay.
So if your medical device uses sensors, and you know they have their own IP, they have their own filing and stuff like that. Let's just use the example of overheating, right? And there's an issue on their end after a couple of years, but you're using it in your device. Like, how do you fight against that? And like, what can you do? Or even if your medical device is using another class 1. So a lot of the wearables, for example, they require something to get the microneedle inside the body, right?
Yeah.
And so that external class 1 device, if you're using it just to lower your cost at the beginning, like what do you do?
What do you do? Why is this my problem? Yeah, so it's a good question. So I haven't heard that stat, but as you mentioned it makes a lot of sense because there's actually different levels of recall. So class 1, class 2, class 3. I'm not an expert on the recall aspect, but basically anytime you take a field action, according to the FDA, it's classified as a recall. So an 80% statistic I don't think it's as scary as it needs to be. A field action could be, you identify the safety issue and you just notify your customers, because it's not so bad that you need to clear out everything in the field. The worst is when you have to clear out everything in the field and bring it home, because you're like, this is so unsafe. This shouldn't be out in the field. For something like an overheating where it's your supplier's product, it's irrelevant. At the end of the day, you own your design. You as the legal manufacturer, the legal entity, you own your product, you own your design, which means you own the design decisions to go with that supplier. So you, by going with that supplier, you are taking on that risk. There's no company that makes every single part in every single product that goes into their overall product. Like that just doesn't exist. Well, maybe it does if you are making very like low complexity products, but if you've got a sensor in it, it immediately is a little bit more complex. So you own that risk. And so the recall, if you were in a situation where that overheating, and this comes back to that risk, that overheating causes a risk that is high enough that it will cause an injury or death, then you will have to issue a recall, and that will still fall under your company. So the action of the recall and the liability can actually be separated. So the recall would still fall under you because it's still your product. But from a legal perspective, you might be able to take action against your supplier. You may or may not. I'm not saying that you absolutely can, but there's liability and then there's action. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all for having me in today. I really appreciated talking